people who join late can catch up with us as we get started. So I am Stephanie Clark. I'm the manager of the Records Management Unit here at the State Archives. This is an Introduction to Public Records Law class. I have a couple of just bits and pieces to share with you before I launch into the actual presentation. We have another class that we do regularly remote called Records Management for Modern Communications. The next session we have scheduled is Wednesday, September 20th. You can register for that class. We still have openings. You can register on iLearn. There are links to the class itself on our website. So if you haven't seen that one yet, take a look. You can still register. And that class and this class right now are classes that we're going to be obviously regularly offering every month, remote, in person, whatever people prefer to do. I have a number of other classes that I have in the works, so everyone who attends this training, I will be adding you to a list that I have to receive notifications when new trainings are scheduled. If you don't want to be on that list, let me know and I can remove you. But that way you'll get an email and you'll find out how to register and find out some information about classes that we have coming up, new classes. So a little housekeeping, if you have a question and you want to type it into the chat, I have previously tried to follow along with those as I'm doing this presentation and end up getting behind. So what I'd like to do is if you do have a question during the course of the presentation and you want to type it into the chat window, I will look at those at the end and try to answer them for everyone. If it's something that requires a little bit more detail follow-up, I'll reach out to you via email because I have everyone's email address who registered for this, and I'll set up a time to either meet with you in person or talk to you about the specific issue that you've mentioned in your question. So I will follow up with everyone. Another bit of housekeeping, if you haven't entered your name, it looks like everyone has. Great. So if I see your name in the list as having attended, then I will log that in iLearn. So you will get iLearn credit if you've attended the class. So launching right in. So a little bit about the State Archives, so just so you have a little bit of context. There are a couple of different things that we do here at the State Archives. We have 3 distinct units. One of them is our Administrative Rules and Publications unit. So just like that sounds, they process and publish all administrative rules for the state of Oregon. That's in-house at the archives. They also publish something called the Blue Book, which is an almanac that's published every 2 years, kind of a snapshot of Oregon history, a snapshot in time of what was happening in Oregon. So that's something we also do here. Another thing that we do is we have a reference room, so the public can come and access permanently valuable historic documents here in the Archives building in Salem. And that's a really popular thing with genealogists, attorneys, and students, anyone researching. So if you haven't come to see the reading room and you're in Salem, stop by and take a look, and they can help you find what you're looking for. The third distinct unit that we have here at the State Archives is the unit that I'm the manager of, the Records Management Unit. Included in that unit is the State Records Center. So that's actually a warehouse where state agencies can send records that are not active currently. They can send those out and store them with us for a cheaper cost than you might find with Iron Mountain or something comparable privately. The distinction with that is that we don't charge for individual pulls, so that's a really popular thing. If you were to shop around, you'd see that other vendors tend to charge you an arm and a leg just to access your records. So that's something that's been pretty popular over the years. We still have capacity though. A few years ago it was full, and I don't know if word has gotten out with people that it's no longer full. So we're still taking new records, and reach out to me if you have questions about how to file records there. Another part of the records management unit is something called the Oregon Records Management Solution, and that is basically a project where our records analysts help people set up their own electronic records management system. I will talk a little bit about that during this presentation, but that's not the point of this presentation specifically. So if you have other questions about that, I have a contact for the administrator of that project at the end of the slides. And then the last part of what we do is what I'm doing right here, advice and assistance. I write retention schedules. So if you have a question about your retention schedule, I am your gal. That would be something that we could go over in person or over the phone. Email is fine too. So yeah, I will talk about what is a retention schedule for those of you who this may be your first introduction to all things public records. So that's fine. This is a very basic level presentation. Might be boring for some of you, but I hope to have a little bit of new information there too. And another side note, I actually will come and do this presentation for you, for your staff. So this isn't like a once a month thing necessarily. I offer it regularly because it keeps being popular. There keeps being more and more interest. So I have been continuing to set these up, but I can do a remote one if you're in a far-flung corner of Oregon. If you have some sort of special need where our agency is really struggling with managing our email. Can you come and do this presentation and mostly talk about email? I will absolutely do that. So just let me know. Just reach out to me and we'll find something that works for whatever is going on with your agency. So why do people worry about records management? Unfortunately, we usually hear from people when they've encountered some sort of problem associated with managing their records, which is unfortunate. So that's why I like to try to do these as often as possible to get in front of some of these problems that might occur with agencies. Storage does cost money. So if you're never destroying anything, your storage costs are obviously just going to keep going up and up and up, and that's not just paper, but also, electronic storage is cheap, but it's not free, especially with the rapid pace at which we are creating new records electronically that need to be managed over the course of their life cycle. Legal liability is one of the biggest catalysts for people to try to figure out their records and try to get a handle on their records. If you are keeping records around that should have been destroyed, if someone requests them or there's some sort of e-discovery issue and you're required to produce the records, that is not the time to go back and start cleaning things up. So the point is, according to DOJ, if you still have your records around, you have to provide them. You don't get to say, oh, these were supposed to be destroyed 10 years ago, let's just destroy them now. There are legal hold issues, and so sometimes maybe that works out for the agency. Maybe the records that they have around are helpful to them in that legal issue, but 9 times out of 10 from what we've seen, it actually benefits an agency to not have excessive records around. Usually it can come back and bite you if you've had some of those complicated issues with records. Settling out of court, unfortunately, again, is what we've seen time and time again, and that can be an issue of maybe the agency can find the records, but then they have to pay an attorney to review them to make sure that there's not exempt information that's being disclosed. Depending on your agency's mission, that may be more important than in other groups of records. Sometimes you can't even really find the right records. So that's another issue that can cause people to settle out of court. And in the court of public opinion, if you're settling out of court, it looks like an admission of guilt for your agency, and that is not good for anyone. We don't need help, tarnishing our reputation as state employees any more than we already get. We're all trying to do our best. We don't need extra heat in that department. So poor records management, I've also found in talking to people, it can be really bad for employee morale. If you can't find what you need, you are frustrated, you're spending extra time not doing your job that you're supposed to be doing, but actually trying to find records. That is not a morale booster. so to speak. Tons of duplicate content means that you're never really sure if you've destroyed the records. So if you've decided, okay, we're going to comply with our records retention schedule, here's where our records are stored internally, now it's time to destroy records, let's get rid of them, that's all well and good, but if every employee has their own private stash of records, have you really destroyed the record copy? Possibly what you think is the record copy, but if you've got those duplicates around, if there's a request, you still have to provide access to those if they're still floating around somewhere. So that can be a real liability. So the first step is to understand what the law actually says. So in terms of retention and disposition, which is our jurisdiction here at the State Archives, the definition of a public record is actually pretty specific, and it's a 3-part definition, and I've outlined this here. Do not worry about taking notes. I will send this presentation out to everyone who registered for the class. So you don't have to furiously write this down. 3-part definition, any record that you might be looking at in your place of work needs to meet all 3 of these. So it's all 3 parts, A, B, and C, not just one of them to be considered a public record for retention and disposition, meaning it needs to be on a schedule in order to destroy it. So that 3-part definition, prepared, owned, used, or retained, very broad. That's a very broad part, right? We want to narrow that down a little bit more. So relates to a specific activity, transaction, or function. So that means, is this part of your job? Is this your agency's responsibility to create? That may not always be the case. We may be storing a lot of reference stuff that isn't necessarily our duty to maintain long term. Maybe it's stuff that we've received from another agency and it's their duty, or this is an issue I got a call about this morning. Maybe we contract with DAS to support one of our services, and you would want to have a discussion to make sure that everyone understands, okay, DAS is providing this service, they're the record copy of this document. Everyone needs to be on the same page so that mistakes aren't made. Part C, necessary to satisfy the fiscal, legal, administrative, and historical. These are the 4 categories that we look at when we're writing our records retention schedule. So legal and fiscal are pretty straightforward. Those are pretty intuitive. Administrative would be, what is your business need for this record? Is this actually something that you need to do your job? Historical would be a very, very small subset of records that we come across in our daily work. So this would be, governing board meeting minutes, maybe really important final reports. If you work for a city, it'd be orders and resolutions, things like that are historically valuable. Less than 5% probably of all records that we create. So the last part that I've included here, I like to include this because this changed in 2011. So this law is relevant regardless of format. So that's a really, really important point to make, and I'll be reiterating that throughout the presentation. So these laws that I will talk about don't just apply to paper. That's kind of the main point that I want people to take away from this. We as state employees are going to keep using new technology to create records. The schedules are relevant regardless of the technology that was used to create the records. So there isn't some magic software that you're going to use in the future that, oh, now all of those records are no longer relevant. We want to keep the rolling definition of what a public record is to be more inclusive, so that every time there's some new format or new software that people are starting to use, we don't need to go and update that public records law. That doesn't really make sense long term. So, the way that our laws are written in this state, unless you can prove, that the records fall under one of those exemptions, we err on the side of access. So that's a really important thing to keep in mind. Access questions, I would want to, if you had more in-depth ones about public records requests, I would want to possibly refer you to your legal counsel or DOJ. But the reason that we have our laws written this way in Oregon is that we want to be open. We want to be transparent. We want the public to understand why we're making the decisions that we're making. As public employees, we are using tax dollars, we are spending their money. We want them to know how we're making these decisions, how we're coming up with these policies that affect their lives. So another important point to make, we've seen several cases over the years that have specifically touched on, you know, real life instances of people having to turn over their personal home computers. Oregon Public Records Law is relevant regardless of where you're doing your work. So if I, as a state employee, take a bunch of work home, working on it on my personal laptop, if there's a request for those records, I can't then say, you know, to my boss, oh no, it's my personal laptop, it's hands off, it's exempt. Not the case. If I'm using my personal device to do my job for the state, I need to be prepared to hand that device over, have some way of saving that on a state server, whether you're VPNing back in to the network to save records that are relevant to your job, or emailing them back to your state email address after you've completed something if you're working from home. The best thing to do is have it written in your internal records management policy. So everyone attending this call should know what their records management policy is. If you don't have one, contact me. I can give you some really good examples. That is step one of getting a handle on your records internally, is to have a policy so that people actually know what they're supposed to be doing. That way, you know, if something goes wrong, you can point to the policy and say, you know, these employees knew about this policy, here's where they signed, that sort of thing. So you would definitely want to have this specific issue addressed on your records management policy, whether it's your city, county, state agency that you work for. Everyone should know, you know, if I'm taking work home and working on my personal device, these are the expectations for a time period with which, you know, during which I would need to then save those records back on a state-controlled server. Or maybe you decide as a group, our agency is not going to allow people to use personal devices. So they have to take a work laptop and then figure out a way to save that, you know, back onto the network somehow. And again, we don't distinguish based on format. It's the content that we schedule. So you're not going to look through your retention schedule and see, you know, Word documents are this long and spreadsheets are this long. It's going to be focused on why the record is created. What is the purpose of the record, not the actual format for the record. So last year, we put out some new guidelines with updated language and guidelines that we hoped would help people to figure out where to start with managing their records, specifically electronic records. So OAR 166 Division 17, take a look at it if you haven't looked at it before. We set rules, actually, administrative rules, for what you should look for if you are selecting an electronic records management system for your entity. What are some of the things that are important from the records management perspective? A lot of the times you'll see systems out there that are called, you know, electronic document management. Well, those you would want to take a closer look. Is there actually any retention or disposition aspect to that system at all, or is it just going to be a dumping ground for things? So the OAR sets out minimum guidelines that we expect people to meet if they're purchasing an electronic records management system. One of those is that the system be Department of Defense 5015.2 certified. That is listed in there. You don't have to memorize that. And the goal for that is that we would really like systems to meet that standard, because we know that there are certain things about those systems that are important for long-term preservation. For example, if you have a system that's Department of Defense 5015.2 certified, there is an expectation of interoperability, meaning you can put records in, yes, that's very easy to do, but can you get records out? that has been one of the most difficult things that I have seen agencies try to work through with older legacy systems. You know, maybe you get together, you attend vendor presentations, and one of the systems that you're using, it looks really great, it looks really easy, it's fun, you know, super easy to search or collaborate in some way, but there's no way to actually get the records out when you inevitably want to sunset away from that system. We don't know of any systems that will be around forever, right? So the idea is that you want to have the records in a format that can be easily exported by you, that you don't need, you know, an expensive developer to write code to get those out for you. And you want the information about the records to come with them. So you don't just want a pile of PDFs in a folder. You want those PDFs and the associated metadata, which is information about a record, like when it was created, it's, you know, the title, if there are special fields that were entered about that record to tell you what it is. You want all of that to be able to come out so that you can then import that into a new system. I cannot tell you how many people I've worked with when I go in to help them and look at one of their old legacy systems, and there's no usable way to get the stuff out, so they have to keep supporting it even though their users want to use another system now. So the poor IT department has to figure out a way to, you know, if there's still retention on those records, sometimes they're really long-term records. The IT department has to figure out a way to keep supporting that, and now this new system that they want to use. A good example of this would be working with school districts. A lot of them, for the Oregon student record, that's a 75-year record after graduation. So thinking about looking at those past records and the formats that they come in, it really is just taking a walk down the history of, you know, it's like a format museum. You know, I meet with people and it's, you know, these years are in microfilm, these are in paper in boxes in a warehouse, and then we started using this system, so now we have to keep moving that one forward. So these are some of the things that we took into account when writing these rules. Digitization of records is laid out there. So if you're undergoing any scanning projects, we set some rules that we think people should look at in terms of minimum resolution. So certain types of records might need to have, you know, higher resolution depending on what the record is. So take a look at that before you undergo any major scanning projects. Retention of records in an electronic format. We set forth some minimum file format standards that we're comfortable with for long-term records. So for example, we put PDF as the standard for the minimum standard for text documents. If you use PDFA, that's great too. We didn't want to require PDFA because not every, you know, city with 2 employees can afford the software that you would need to create those PDFAs. So we didn't want to put up barriers to prevent people from even using any standards, if that makes sense. So, and the reason that we chose PDF is not because we think it's a perfect format. None of the formats we chose in these guidelines we think are perfect. It's the idea that if as a city or an agency or a county, you know, all of our long-term records are stored as PDFs, if you find out that PDF is going away, you don't then have to, you know, figure out this group of records is stored as PDF, this group of records is this type of document. You don't have to come up with a separate migration plan for all of your 100 different formats. So if you've got one format that you're using, you write it in your policy, then if you know that format is going away, you can come up with an easy migration plan to whatever the next format is that comes along after PDF. System security and maintenance, those weren't really updated that much, but if you've never looked at Division 17, do take a look because it's pretty important stuff. So the first step to having actual compliance within your entity is to have these written policies written down. Have them address use, access, retention, and ownership. So This should be part of your new hire training. Make sure that every person who's creating records or accessing records knows that they're doing that these records are not their personal property. That's something that I come across a lot. People are invested in their work. They care about what they do. They put a lot of themselves into it. I totally understand that. But it isn't up to each individual to decide how long to keep records. So I can't just take a look at the documents I've been working on over the past couple of years and say, I don't need that anymore personally, I'm going to trash it. It's important for state employees to understand that there are guidelines for this already. There is, a list of retention schedules. If your records that you create aren't on your schedule or you can't find them, that's when you reach out to me. But for the most part, they should all be on there, especially if you work for a city or a county. But having staff understand that is really important. And if you have any barriers with that, let me know. I'm happy to do. I've done all staff meetings. I've met with, smaller groups and just sort of explain some of this to them. It can really help to have like an outside person come in and tell people what their responsibilities are, because everyone is responsible for their own records. Use the schedule systematically and routinely. Sounds really easy, right? So what is a schedule? Basically, your records retention schedule is your only legal authorization to destroy public records. So you can't get together as a city, pass an ordinance through the council or whatever and decide to make all city records 1 year. We've had people try to do stuff like that before. Legally, all records destruction must be approved by the state archivist. So she works with me to review all of the records retention schedules that I write. They should be all inclusive. So like I said before, if there's a category that you aren't quite sure about, let me know, and maybe it is something we need to capture that hasn't been captured yet. Or maybe there's just a different category that didn't occur to you the first time you looked at it. It doesn't require the creation of records. So if you work for the county, you're looking at the county schedule and you come across, something related to a special district, it doesn't mean just because you share a schedule that you have to then figure out how to create those records. I know that sounds kind of obvious, but there's been some confusion about that in the past, so I want to make sure that people understand that. It's not meant to create more work for you. It's meant to provide a perceived destruction date for groups of records that you're already creating in the course of your work. So again, when we write the retention schedules, we do not schedule them. We don't write them based on format. We write them based on the content. So that is what you'll see when you start looking at your schedule. So here's an example of the city general records retention schedule, OAR 166, Division 200. You'll see a brief description at the top, and each kind of rule section is going to be broken down into functional groups, and then you'll see the actual series listed. After the title, you'll see the retention statement. So it's really important to pay attention to what the retention statement actually says. If you were to quickly glance, you might see, oh, 3 years. I can delete these after, or destroy these after 3 years. But some of these could be quite different. 3 years after final payment, that might not be made for 20 years from now. So you really want to pay attention to what that rule text actually says and not just a quick glance at the years. So county and special district schedule, this is kind of the old model of the formats. I'm going to be working with every general schedule to rewrite them to look more like this city schedule, more simplified and streamlined, user-friendly, stripping out a lot of these bulky descriptions that I have received feedback over the years that people find the descriptions off-putting and hard to read. So, over the years, you'll see me clean these up. Right now, I'm actually working on the state agency general schedule. So if you work for a state agency and you want to weigh in, I'm currently doing the rule committee meetings, and we've got a draft put together. So let me know if you'd like to take a look at that draft and give me some feedback. So this is what a special schedule looks like. If you work for a city or a county, please disregard this portion. This is for the state agencies. So I will write a special schedule for a state agency when they have records that they produce that cannot be found anywhere on the state agency general schedule, which is the case for most state agencies. Obviously, each agency is so completely unique with their mission and their function. Not every agency is going to have their needs met by, the general schedule, because they're all so specific in their missions. So that's, in cases like that, that's when I'll write a special schedule. Also, when records are permanent, we want to list them on a special schedule, because all permanent records created by a state agency legally eventually have to come to us at the state archives so that we can preserve them and provide access to them long term. And the reason that we do that is that we don't want 183 state agencies and boards and commissions in Oregon to have to create their own unique humidity and temperature controlled archival environment to store records long term. We want to have one central location with our friendly reference staff to provide access to those, and professional archivists to accession them. It just makes more sense to have everything centralized, so that's something to look for as well. So here's the fun part. How do we actually use our schedule? Well, in the paper world, we kind of had, you might say, physical limitations with how records might be organized. So you've really only got a certain number of folders that you can fit, in each divider, in a filing cabinet, in a drawer. And at some point, people that started filing the records picked some logical way to start filing them. So theoretically, right? So this group of records, these are actually retention schedules in one of our cabinets, and these are old, outdated ones, but they would be organized by the name of the agency. If you work for some sort of licensing board, maybe you've got things organized by the person you're licensing, maybe their number. If you work for corrections, maybe it's by inmate. So there are logical organizational methods, and traditionally in the paper world, there were what you might call gatekeepers. So people that knew how the records were organized. Maybe you even had a filing clerk. So maybe staff wasn't even going into the filing cabinets to refile things. They were setting them on top of the shelves and letting other people do it. Well, in the electronic world, we do not have those physical limitations that prevent you from filing lots of file folders into each other. There's actually physical limitations in the paper world. In a shared drive, you don't have that. So you can create as many layers as you want. They can be your own personal organizational method that maybe no one else understands. This is an example one of my staff created for this presentation for me. And you can see we started out with our years. We did use, 2007 year end. Great. Nice attempt to group things. We've got a budgets folder, but then we've got stuff like, Brian miscellaneous. We've all seen that on our shared drives. And then it looks like they gave up and just started dumping things on the top level, because if you don't know where to file something, you're going to do one of two things. You're going to create a new section on the shared drive and try to figure out your own way to organize it, or you're going to squirrel it away onto your personal drive, which is not what we want. We do not want staff hiding record copies of things on their own personal drive, because long term what that looks like is, well, yes, we all want to be here forever, but we're not going to be. We will all either leave or retire someday, and then the poor saps who are left will have to deal with our records, right? So how have we organized our records? Have we squirreled things away in a way that just makes sense to us as a person? Or, and this is the preferred method, have we picked a shared area and gotten together and decided how we were going to organize the records and actually organize them that way so that people know where to find things, so that they're not creating their own personal hidden away forever piles. From our work with people, we have found that fewer categories, obviously that makes sense, is easier to navigate through. Organizing by broad functional areas instead of, what is the division called this week? A lot of us in state agency land, we'll get a new director, there will be some new project, or, through the legislative session, things will get reorganized, and we'll have be rebranded, or our division will be moved around and things will be shifted around. So if we focus on the records themselves and work backwards from there, I think that we will have areas in our shared drives that make a lot more sense to more people and aren't so division specific. So, and this is probably the most important part, grouping by retention requirements is a really important thing to think about. You really do not want to have to manually look at each record when it's time to destroy things. No one will ever do that, right? Or you don't have someone on staff whose full-time job is to manually check records for destruction. So if you can save yourself some time in the future by grouping by that desired destruction date, then you will thank yourself later, and it actually might be possible to do records management that way. So here is an example of the cleaned up version of some of the records I had on the messy version slide. So if you look to the left where we can see the folder navigation, employee personnel records might be a good top level folder. That's pretty general. Then further down we've got benefit records. Within that we've got the non-PERS records, would just be a straight 3 years. And then we've got our year folders. So if I'm a new employee and I've got some benefit records to file, this is going to be pretty easy to find. I'm not going to have to create my own personal folder for these. And then, PERS enrollment records 75 years, they've got their own separate folder. We don't want to group the 3-year records with the 75-year records if we intended to actually destroy records in the future. So we can clean up our shared drive. We can all decide to use the shared drive in the new cleaned up format, but eventually things do get busy. People slide back into their old habits, and that is why in our field there has been, for a few decades now, increasing use of something called an electronic records management system. So an electronic records management system is sort of what it sounds like, where you can file electronic records and not have to, print them out or, stash them on a shared drive. You can file them directly from, either as an email or, from your actual computer. But you can also track paper records, and that doesn't sound intuitive, but I'll explain kind of a for instance of how we use an electronic records management system to do both in our own agency. So Secretary of State's office has an electronic records management system. Our audits division uses it to track their audits, obviously. So they've got a main folder for the audit. They've got a main folder for the actual final audit that is published. And then they've got kind of subfolders for where they have their preparation stuff. So they've got their emails with the agency. They've got all of their notes scanned in. They have everything kind of in separate folders there. But then also within that folder, they've got placeholders for boxes. So maybe it doesn't make sense to scan a bunch of stuff in because it only has a couple of years left on the retention. It's not always a good idea to scan. Everyone, wants everything to be electronic, but if things don't have that much retention left, it might not make sense to scan them. So that's when having a placeholder in the system to show you where a box is located is really helpful. So maybe I search for, an audit that was completed. Maybe I search for the agency name that was audited. I'm going to get a results list of the final document of the preparation stuff, and then I'm also going to see the placeholder that shows me, okay, there's a box located downstairs on shelf 5, row 3. That is helpful for finding records. That is also helpful for destruction, because the benefit of an electronic records management system is that the records retention schedule is actually built into the back end of the software. So people know only that they are picking, that they're creating an audit report in the system. What they don't know is that we as records managers have calculated the retention for them so that it's automatically applied based on what they selected the folder as. So that means when we send them their destruction report at every 6 months, they will see their list of electronic records that are up for destruction, but they'll also see their box. So they don't have to create a separate process, where they have to go down and check each box to see what's ready to be destroyed. There's an easy way to sign off, and then they can go down, grab that box, get it out, get it shredded, and move on with their day. So having one central place to find all of their records has been completely life-changing in terms of work processes and people not spending all of their time and resources that way. So what we've learned, manual records management, you can try to clean up your shared drive. It's not going to be 100% foolproof though. The way that human nature is, we get busy and things tend to backslide into what's comfortable. There are no physical reminders. So what I mean by that is, if I've got a big pile of paper on my desk, that is going to be physically irritating to me or my coworkers. Someone is going to tell me to get my desk cleaned up, right? But if I have a shared drive or a folder on my desktop, I can keep dumping stuff in there. No one is the wiser. It doesn't make my desktop uglier, right? So that's something that maybe is not so good about the electronic world, is that we're not physically irritated by that. We can hide that away and not have to think about it. So copies abound. We've got a lot of duplicates. We've got a lot of records that we've emailed around to each other. Maybe we're working on a draft of something and we want everyone to weigh in. So, how many times do we send that back and forth internally? Something that we use our electronic records management system in-house for is, we've got one copy of the record. I basically can send a link to that record to my staff. They can all take a turn editing it. All those edits are saved, but we still only have one record. We don't have multiple copies that maybe I have on my shared drive, on my personal drive. We've got one on the shared drive. We've got them in email. That doesn't exist for us. So that's something that, thank goodness, we had. I've been here for 5 years. We've had that since the beginning for me. So I haven't experienced the archives shared drive because we just don't have one anymore. Security can be a big concern. Are records being stored appropriately? Does HR have their own special space on the shared drive? These are all questions that you would want to ask. Public records requests. If records are stored all over the place, it's a lot harder to fulfill those requests and be 100% confident in our results. Especially, a lot of the email requests that you might get, depending on how your IT staff does it, maybe they ask you to find the emails, maybe they go and have to, restore backup copies. Every agency is different the way that they handle it. That's why when we, as soon as we get a new Secretary of State here at the archives, we set up, so that their email is automatically going into our electronic records management system, because we know that is going to be the majority of our public records requests going forward, and it's going to be a lot easier to sort and search by those keywords for this new administration if it's in one place instead of everyone's individual email accounts. So in Oregon, you have a couple of options for electronic records management systems. You can buy your own system, which is what we did in 2008. We purchased our own standalone electronic records management system, HP trim. it was around $1 million for us as a state agency to do that. That is cost prohibitive for a lot of entities. So we have something in Oregon that I mentioned at the very beginning called Oregon Records Management Solution, where we have over 50 entities that we work with, and this is a project that is open to any state entity. So you can work for a sanitation district and join this project. You can be, a 2-person city office. So basically the way that the licensing works is you pay for, it's like a software as a service thing. So you pay per user per month. You're basically buying into the project, and what you get is the state archives. Actually, I can't even believe we do this, but we build the system for you. So we write the retention schedules into the software for you. We calibrate, special record types for your entity, and we train you. So we will train every single user that you bring on. We have 5 analysts that do this for us right now, and they are very busy. It's a very popular thing because agencies that would have never been able to afford their own system can actually buy into this for what ends up being actually less than what you would pay HP to get the actual just software licenses without any infrastructure. So if you have questions about that, let me know. I can put you in contact with the administrator of the project. Email. A lot of questions about email all the time. The problem with email is that it's chock full of public records, right? And our IT department controls deletion. So if you don't know what is being done with your email, definitely find out. Ask your IT department, how long do we keep our email? Do we ever destroy it? Are we keeping everything? The most difficult part of scheduling email is that it isn't just that you're going to find like a category on the retention schedule that says email. That doesn't exist because, as I talked about before, format doesn't matter for scheduling. It's going to be the content that's going to tell you how long to keep the record. That sounds really complicated. We've come up with easier ways for people to try to tackle this. What we found is the less that people actually have to sort their own email, the more likely they are to try to actually do something, to try to actually comply with their records retention schedule. We've also found that email content can be predicted. So I, as the unit manager, have a certain set of duties, right? Every state employee, every city, county employee has a certain set of duties, and those duties are going to fall under different categories in the retention schedule. If you look at kind of the longest possible retention for some of those general categories and group things by that, that is a lot easier than trying to, sort everything, year by year by year. So this is something that we've seen at the national level to try to tackle email as well. At the national level, they call it Capstone. And basically, they did kind of an extreme version at the National Archives. But if you want advice on how to start doing this in-house, let me know. I can help you. I can help you look at the schedule and try to figure out what categories might work depending on, your function and your longest possible retentions. I, as the unit manager, am going to have a different longest possible retention than, say, the state archivist next door. A lot of her email is going to be permanent based on her position. So that's something that you want to look at. Because the worst thing you can do is, I've seen very extreme situations on both sides. So I've seen entities that are only keeping everything for a year, which is absolutely not in compliance with their retention schedule. There's no entity that's longest retention is a year. And I've seen the most common, which is just to keep everything forever, which is fine. You're not in compliance with your schedule in that respect either. Most people are just worried about destroying something too soon. But what you're doing is creating more work for yourself long term, because if you have those records still, if you have those emails still, even if they should have been destroyed before, you still have to provide access to them. So that is going to increase your administrative burden for providing access to those years from now. obviously it's just going to keep compounding. So if you want to get started on cleaning up your email today, these are some of my tips for trying to understand what is not a public record for retention and disposition, meaning these things that I've listed here aren't your responsibility to maintain the record copy of. So FYIs, CCs, informational notices. For the most part, ads, listservs, event announcements, those are things that, you know, obviously if it's in your inbox, you didn't create it. So that's something to think about, unless it's in your job description to retain, you know, event announcements that your manager created, something like that. You know, there would be very specific situations where you would have to keep those. But for the most part, things like governor's food drive, we don't need 30,000 of those sitting around on state servers. Personal correspondence I throw in here, even though you shouldn't have any of it in your state email to begin with. So draw that line. Make sure that your staff knows what that line is. Do not use your personal email accounts to do your job for the state, and don't have personal private conversations using your state email address. It's very easy, very intuitive, right? But a lot of us feel like our email is private somehow. I don't know why people think that, but it absolutely is not. So we've seen a couple of high-profile examples of people not quite getting that message and then being a little bit embarrassed when some of their private conversations end up, you know, on the cover of the Oregonian. Articles, reference materials, things that, you know, maybe I come across some nerdy records management article that I think my staff would enjoy reading. After they look at it, they can destroy it. They should not be keeping it around. And actually, after I send it, I can delete it. Purge your deleted items. You'd be surprised. People, if you have email quotas in-house, people can forget that their deleted items actually count towards that quota. So go ahead and purge that regularly if you're not already. And then I just throw this in here because if you ever have to find an email again, having a more specific subject line is very helpful. So for future you, don't just name something meeting, right? In the subject line, put meeting on 9/8 regarding records management. You know, be as specific as you can, because you don't want to have to sort through 1,000 emails called meeting, looking for the one that you actually are trying to find. So generally speaking, if it's an internal email, the sender is responsible for maintaining that record copy. If it's an email from an outside source, as the state employee in the conversation, you, as the recipient, you need to maintain that copy. If you use Outlook, go back to your desk, or actually, I guess you're at your desk right now, hopefully. But if you're in a group conference room, go back to your desk and use the cleanup tool. Select your inbox or select your sent mail and click cleanup. And what that does is it takes the last piece of the string in your conversation thread with someone, and it keeps only the last piece of that, and it gets rid of all of those extra duplicative emails. So what it will do is it will keep, if there's a part of the string that had an attachment, it will keep that. It is very smart. If it has part of the conversation where maybe I forwarded something, started a side conversation, or just replied to one person in the thread, it will save that. It can recognize a unique part of the conversation and keep those pieces as well. So a lot of the times I will get calls from people that are just straight up overwhelmed with the sheer volume. Maybe you went on vacation and came back and you've got hundreds of emails to sort through. So I kind of throw out a couple of tips, ways to kind of tackle your email without getting completely overwhelmed. So if you can start with the ones that you can delegate, that's great. Make it someone else's problem, get it off of your plate, give them an opportunity to help someone else out. Delete things from that list that I talked about before. Respond would be a category where, you know, it's like yes or no. Yes, I can make it to that meeting, or no, I can't. That sort of thing. The quick, get it off your plate and get it out of there. Defer, that might be where I need to follow up with someone. So I'm not sure what my calendar is. I'll email you next week. And if I do that in my own email, I usually put a little flag so that I can find that again. That means I promised to do something, so I better have a way of tracking that. That would be the ones where, okay, I actually do need to find some, schedule for someone or do a little bit more research. Maybe I need to look at federal regulations associated with something. So those are going to be the ones that will take more time, but don't let those get in the way of, cleaning out your inbox a little bit so that you can actually breathe, right, and not feel too overwhelmed to do anything. So it is a very interesting time to be an electronic records manager because we have new technology coming out every year. People are finding new ways to collaborate with each other and share information. So it makes it really challenging to try to track all of that stuff and stay on top of it. So social media, is it a public record? Short answer is it can be. So it depends on the way that your agency is using it, and this is a really, really important thing to have in your policy, in your internal records management policy that you should all have. You should have a statement that addresses how your agency is going to use social media. So maybe you only post duplicate content using social media. That is a really good philosophy to have. The reason is that if you use Facebook or Twitter or something like that, when you're clicking OK or I accept to the terms of agreement, basically you are signing away your rights to the records. So the records are not actually your property anymore. They belong to Facebook. They belong to Twitter. And that means that Facebook can keep them forever, or it means Facebook can look at your account tomorrow and say, we don't like this account, it's gone, and delete all of the records that you've posted. So that's a really important thing to know. You don't own the records that you post there. Facebook can do anything that they want with them. And as a state employee, that is a problem for us because we need to be able to provide access to these records, especially if they're unique, for their duration, for their life cycle. So a really good idea would be to only use social media for duplicate content. If there's any sort of conversation, you have some sort of interaction with a constituent that rises to the level of being a public record for retention and disposition, figure out a way to capture that, even if it's just a screenshot. That's kind of the poor man's version. There's also social media capture software out there. If you want any advice on where to start with that, let me know. I'm happy to help you. Twitter has a built-in mechanism where you can kind of produce a report of your activity. That's pretty useful. But if you work for an agency like a law enforcement agency and you're using Facebook as like your sole way to communicate with the public and you're having real conversations with them that you aren't then referring to your state email address, then you really want to take this seriously, because those records absolutely can be requested and will be and should be filed, with incident case files, investigations, things like that, because they absolutely count as public records. So text messages, this is a tricky one because, believe it or not, it's still a little bit the Wild West for text messages. Who holds them? Not Verizon, not AT&T. If you call them up and say, I'm a state employee, I need all my text messages for the past year, they don't have them. They have their own backup copies, possibly, that they have on a timer that they destroy regularly, or maybe they never even have captured them at all. Basically, what they will have is a log. All they're going to have is, this number contacted this number at this time for this long. That's all they're going to have, or sent an image or a text to this number at this time for, based on the account. So you don't know how long those are retained. And if this is really important, if people are using text messages as part of their regular function, a substantive business-related discussion, then you need to capture that. So whether it is having people forward those text messages to their state email address, or, we've had people set up a rule that if I'm texting this number, CC my state email address each time. That is possible. That is, again, the poor man's version. There is mobile device management software that you can purchase that basically gives you an app on your phone to communicate with other state employees. Or maybe you'll get together and decide, in our policy, we're not going to allow any text messaging at all for state business. This is something you have to decide as an agency, and absolutely have it be consistent and make sure that people know what the policy is. So, new frontiers, like I said, it's a really fun time, new challenging time to be a records manager. Instant messages. We have seen many instances where these have been requested and people have had to provide them. And unfortunately, with instant messages, if your agency is using that, for some reason, maybe it's some psychological reason, people feel like they're private and they have conversations that maybe they wouldn't have if they knew that these were still a public record. Maybe they have private, personal conversations. I don't know. We don't allow them at the Secretary of State's office. It's just not a good idea to enable that because you're just creating another format that you have to try to track and provide access to long term. So Voip, this is another new one, newish. So the rule with voicemail is that it's not a public record for retention and disposition, meaning we have no requirement for you to keep it, but it is a public record for access. So that means that if you have a bunch of voicemails and you've been keeping them, if someone requests them, you have to provide them. But we don't require you to keep them at all. So my advice is to listen to them and get rid of them immediately and make sure that everyone else does the same. There's really no reason to keep a voicemail long term. And unfortunately, if you work for a state agency and you're using the Project Music new phone system, or maybe you work for a local government and you're also using a phone system that allows VoIP, if you've got that voicemail and it's attached to an email, for those not familiar, basically you'll get an email and it'll have a little audio file attached. Well, now you've created a public record. Now that is part, especially if you have it transcribed, that's another thing that you can do. So now if you can delete that, that's great. But a lot of the times the IT policies that are controlling the deletion of email aren't taking that into account. So they're retaining those right along with all the other emails, possibly forever. So if you have any control over it, I would disable VoIP. I wouldn't use it. And get rid of your voicemails as soon as you can. Snapchat. Snapchat is kind of a unique one because there is no kind of bridge between Snapchat and any sort of social media capture software. Snapchat won't release the code that these companies need to try to capture this information. So a good rule for Snapchat is that if your agency plans to use it, have some way of either ensuring that it's only duplicate content or capturing it. Our Secretary of State's office decided to start using Snapchat recently. So what one of our reference archivists will do is actually use screen recording software to play. So they'll play the snap and they'll record that, and then they'll end up saving that recording file. So there's no way to get that out of actual Snapchat. We kind of had to rig our own. And that would only be for content that is unique. So if it was composed in-house, we have a copy. If it's unique, then that's when you want to research or figure out how to capture that. Body cams and drones are kind of the same short answer. It doesn't matter how that footage is captured, whether it was on a body cam or a drone. Generally speaking, unless you're a law enforcement agency that has your own special schedule, it's going to be a 30-day retention, just like surveillance tapes. And then if there's some sort of incident or investigation where, there was recording of that incident or something associated with that investigation, then that recording would need to be filed with that case. So for the most part, 30 days is your best bet. Unfortunately, I have talked to people who have either drones or body cams or surveillance cameras that don't allow for a 30-day recording. So unfortunately, these are questions that you want to answer and talk about and keep in mind, before you acquire this new technology. Can we destroy from this? Can we keep it for as long as we need to? These are all questions that you should ask. So in conclusion, storage of information is not the same as management. So we're really good at storing things. We're not very good at managing them generally. Understand your records retention schedule. They are all on our website. Take a look. If you can't find yours or can't find the right category, that's where I come in, so please reach out to me. Have a written policy in-house that addresses records management specifically. Again, if you'd like a good example, I'm happy to send you a couple that you can use. And then, like I mentioned before you purchase new software, all these new systems that maybe look great, seem easy to use, have everyone in the room, have records management people in the room, so that these questions are asked. You know, can we destroy these records, or is this just another forever pile, another system that we have to keep limping along to fulfill our public records obligations? So this is my contact information. And then I also mentioned if you're interested in learning more about the ORMS project, you can contact Chris Stenson, and that's his contact information there. For those of you who attended, I will log that you attended in iLearn. I'm looking through the names here. It looks like everyone identified themselves this time. So thank you for that. That's a lot easier than you know, attendee 1. That's harder to figure out. But thank you very much for your time on a Friday, and I will stick around if people want to type questions in or ask me, or you can always email me. So thanks a lot, everyone.